Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumile Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to Rights and Recourse about this program and any other program, Rights and Recourse at sabc.co.za. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, and today on Rights and Recourse we take a look at the successes and failures of this august multilateral organization. One of the highlights of the General Assembly was the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Framework. Before examining these challenges of this multilateral body still faces, let us join our UN correspondents in New York, Sharon Bryce Peace. Sharon, good morning your time and good afternoon our time.
Good afternoon to you, Dumile.
How important, Sharon, how important is this General Assembly to all the other General Assemblies we've had before?
Well, it gives leaders gathered here, almost 193 of them, the ability to take stock of the successes and, as you mentioned, the many failures of this organization. Questions like whether this has become a multilateral humanitarian organization or if it can still maintain peace around the world. And that takes us down a path of Security Council reform, the reform of financial institutions, what they call the Bretton Woods institutions. So expect to hear a lot about that. As we have in the past, Dumile, remember Security Council reform and the reform of the multilateral system has been part of this conversation now for over 2 decades. But in addition to that, there has been progress, certainly on, as you mentioned, the development agenda. And on Friday, we had the heads of state endorse the new post-2015 agenda that really is quite broad and very, very aggressive. It wants to eradicate poverty by 2030. It wants to achieve gender equality by 2030. So the next 15 years are going to be very, very intensive. And of course, the questions of climate change. So it is very important in that it reshapes, it has the ability to reshape history, the world as we know it, and really deal with problems that have been with us for many, many years. It hopes to eradicate all of those problems over the next 15 years.
The question I wanted to know is how different are the Sustainable Development Goals to the Millennium Development Goals?
Well, there were 8 Millennium Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the major difference between these goals, rather than getting specific as to, Goal 7 as opposed to Goal 8 compared to the MDGs, let me put it this way. The MDGs were decided by experts sitting in a room at the United Nations. The Sustainable Development Goals were part of a multilateral process from the beginning. Governments were on board. The NGOs were on board. Academics and business are part of this conversation. So what you don't hear with the adoption of the SDGs are complaints from civil society. You don't see protests outside the United Nations saying we were not consulted. Everyone is on board. The only other people that need to get on board now are the citizens of the world. All 7 billion people have to hold these governments, business, civil society, have to hold leaders accountable, because it's on the question of implementation where the MDGs have failed, and that is what they're trying to rectify in this post-2015 agenda.
One of the issues shown is the reform of the Security Council or the UN as a whole. And many of our leaders, the African leaders, have actually gone themselves that, I don't know whether we still have shown, one of the issues the African leaders are pushing for is for a seat for an African countries on the UN Security Council, because that is where all decisions take place.
Well, the Esselwini consensus calls for both an expansion of the non-permanent and the permanent category. African countries want 2 permanent seats. And there has been some progress in these intergovernmental negotiations. What you now have, and this is one of the last resolutions taken by the 69th session of the General Assembly, was a resolution basically adopting a text-based approach to these negotiations. Essentially, you've had governments up until now just talking about their positions. Now you have all the the ideas on paper. But here's something interesting. The US ambassador wrote to the president of the General Assembly to say, yes, the United States supports an expansion in both categories, but they are dead against expanding the veto to new permanent members. So that is going to be a bone of contention. It's a non-starter for the United States. And I can tell you, diplomats tell us that even China and to a lesser extent Russia are really against expanding the veto to other members. So this is going to be a sticking point moving forward. In my discussion earlier this week with the International Relations Minister from South Africa, Maite Nkoana Mashabane, she's adamant that if the veto exists, the veto should be extended to everyone holding a permanent seat.
The other thing shown about this General Assembly, opened by a speech by Pope Francis, it looked more like a reverend opening this General Assembly with a prayer.
Well, I think the world needs more prayer, and so absolutely perfect. I think the SDGs, if you look at the Jesuit history of Pope Francis, his ministry has been about getting out to the poor, the slums of Argentina, and so the SDGs in many ways, Dumile, tailor-made for this pontiff. I mean, we're talking here about in his speech about the dismantling of nuclear weapons, that we should stop putting material gain over what is really important in terms of what society needs. He spoke about the need for leaders gathered before him in the General Assembly to really take decisions that don't put their national interests above those of the interests of those people that are facing poverty, are finding themselves in South Sudan today, or in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And so this was a speech that resonated, I think, with everyone in the developing world, because essentially the Pope was endorsing this agenda. But he did caution that leaders should not just come here to make solemn promises. They need to go home and they need to implement. This is for parliaments to implement, to include in the national frameworks in their national jurisdictions, so that these, like the Rome Statute, for example, becomes national law, so that parliamentarians can hold the executive to account.
The other question that many people's lips is, we have seen the many refugees mainly from Syria going across to Europe. Is that going to take center stage during this General Assembly?
Well, what will be centre stage is the general debate in the General Assembly. Of course, we have the SDG summit that will conclude today, and then come tomorrow we have the 70th anniversary, the heads of state, a commemoration of that session. But on the sidelines, there are a number of high-level meetings, one dealing with South Sudan, there's one dealing with Somalia. There will be a Security Council meeting dealing with violent extremism. The President of the United States, Barack Obama, is convening a high-level meeting looking at the future of UN peacekeeping. How effective is it, and what is the role of developed countries moving forward? But as you mentioned, the question of violent extremism, how to deal with ISIS, how to deal with Boko Haram and others, will also be a high-level meeting convened by the Secretary General. So it's all on the table, and that's what happens when you have everyone in town.
The other one was, probably you've forgotten, I asked earlier a question about the refugees that are actually in Europe now, and Europe has a crisis about these refugees, which they prefer to call migrants because they don't want to adhere to the conventions of refugees.
My apologies, I meant to include that one in the list. It will be a high-level meeting. But, of course, all these meetings are interlinked, if you think about it, Dumile. I mean, ISIS and Boko Haram are driving refugees out of Syria, out of Iraq. So it's certainly linked. We know that ISIS has now entered Afghanistan. And if you look at who the populations that make up the majority of those refugees fleeing to Hungary, to Germany, to Austria and elsewhere, it's a large proportion is coming from those conflict-ridden Middle East countries. Of course, it's certainly not limited to those. There are Eritreans that are fleeing. There are people from West Africa that you're finding on boats that are drowning in the Mediterranean. So this is a very comprehensive issue that will certainly be tackled here as well.
Well, President Jacob Zuma is to address the General Assembly. Do you know what time and when is he going to address the General Assembly?
Well, I can tell you he'll address the SDG summit, which concludes today. He'll speak at around 10:30 our time, which should be around 4:30, so an hour and a half from now. And then, of course, tomorrow afternoon, he will address the General Assembly in the 70th annual debate.
Shawan, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate the information that you have given us. It's given us food for thought here in the studio. Thank you very much. Well, that was our our United Nations correspondent, Sherwin Bryce, is talking to us from New York. And to discuss these issues further, we are joined in the studio by Ms. Luando Claso, international law expert from the Center for Civil and Human Rights. We would also like to welcome Ambassador George Nene, an inaugural chair of the Association of South Africa and former ambassador and chief representative at the United Nations for the ANC. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and welcome to the program, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
The question is, the United Nations, you heard there from Sherwin Bryce, Mr. Nene, the United Nations is a completely different animal today than it was in 1945 when it was first started in San Francisco.
No, I don't think it's a completely different animal, because in a multilateral system is rules-based. And the supreme rule that guides all matters relating to the UN is the Charter of the United Nations, which was adopted in 1945. Obviously, things have changed, but whether the United Nations have changed with time or not, you can tell that there are serious debates about the bodies of the United Nations, be they at the administrative level, be at the political level, be at the security level. So there are a lot of debates around that, because then there were about 50 or so. Today we are 193 countries. So it has to adapt to that.
I think the interesting thing is, if you look at the objectives of the UN originally, peacekeeping, and it was born out of World War II and making sure that the world never goes through that again. I think the change is more that, for instance, if you look at the Security Council, even though it's used its veto powers less over the years, there's a sense that when each of the members use their veto powers, it's for self-serving purposes. So there seems to be a move in that sense, that it's no longer for the collective good, but for an individual national interest. And I think that's where the problem is.
While we'll continue discussing the United Nations and the development goals that we spoke about with Sherwin, today's discussion, if you'd like to join us, you can call us on 011-714-5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Recourse, or email us at rights@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
SABC brings to you Rugby World Cup 2015.
Let's do this.
My people, we are getting there, and thanks to you, Party is set to become our country's 12th official language. Here's today's word. Substitute. Replacing a drinking buddy with somebody more fun. That's more like it.
Make it a home game with a case of Castle Lager for only $149.99 and help make Party South Africa's 12th official language. Tops at Spar. Shape things up.
As Africans, we tell a common story. Together, we make up a common picture. For the 7th time since 1998, AfriCities Summit is uniting people from local governments across the continent and asking them to contribute in voice and action to shape a common vision of transformed African cities by 2063. Join us. Learn about the AfriCities 7 Summit, Johannesburg, South Africa, 29 November to 3 December 2015.
Welcome back. The 70th anniversary of the United Nations this year saw the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. Before continuing our discussion, let's take a look at this insert. Well, it looks like we will get that discussion. Whilst we're waiting for that, let me come back here. The formation of the United Nations in 1945, today we have no wars. Our wars are like sporadic wars or, say, guerrilla wars. How does the United Nations deal with those things?
Well, I think the formation of the United Nations made it possible that there is no recurrence of a world war. So we don't have a third world war. I think we can give due to the United Nations. But the United Nations, because its charter says, especially the Security Council, has to deal with issues of international peace and security. So whereas a threat of international peace and security, the United Nations should be involved. But most of those conflicts are intrastate within the state, and some of them are between states. So many of them are political, but they end up, as you know, having conflicts in country A and country B.
Let's take a look at that insert that we spoke about earlier, probably to give us more information on what we are going to be talking about.
The UN was abuzz with activity to welcome Pope Francis for a first visit, who called for greater equity in the multilateral system while calling the SDGs an important sign of hope.
El mundo reclama de todos los gobernantes.
Our world demands of all government leaders a will which is effective, practical, constant, with concrete steps and immediate measures for preserving and improving the natural environment, and thus putting an end as quickly as possible to the phenomenon of social and economic exclusion.
Moments after he left, the SDG summit was convened, with the power of celebrity put to work for the greater good.
Today is a day where we talk about sustainable development goal, and we should talk about sustainable development goal every day, every second, every moment, until we put an end to poverty, until we put our children to school, our young girls to school, and empower boys, men and women all around the world, especially in my continent.
Then the moment, 3.5 years in the making.
May I take it that the Assembly wishes to adopt draft resolution A/70/L1? It is so decided.
The true test of commitment of Agenda 2030 will be implementation. We need action from everyone, everywhere. 17 Sustainable Development Goals are our guide. They are a to-do list for people and planet and the blueprint for success.
Uganda's president, serving as co-chair of the summit, welcomed the adoption of the new set of goals.
Today heralds the dawn of a new era in our collective efforts towards eradicating poverty, improving livelihoods of people everywhere, transforming economies, and protecting our planet.
We cannot hide.
Speaking on behalf of NGOs, Amnesty International urged member states to prove the skeptics wrong, urging accountability.
If governments don't deliver, people should be able to hold them to account through independent mechanisms. It is not enough anymore for governments to say that they are legitimate because they were elected or they have a mandate. They have to be accountable to the people directly on an ongoing basis.
A transformative vision broadly welcomed, with implementation at the national level now holding the key to success.
The 17 goals have clear targets and benchmarks, with a clarion call going out to governments that they need to immediately implement these goals into the national legislative frameworks. The true test will come with implementation, and the true measure of success will come by having achieved these goals come 2030. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Thank you once again to Sherwin Bryce-Pease there. I want to go back to something, to these goals that were set at that meeting. I said earlier, the world is a completely different place from 1945. In the early years, the United Nations was in the throes of making peace, and today this organization has to stabilize countries that are largely unstable politically, and that's the crux of the matter.
I don't think so. I think the United Nations, for a long time, even before the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals, it was dealing with issues of peace and security, it was dealing with issues of development, it was dealing with the issues of law, it was dealing with the issue of human rights. So it was dealing with those things. Just that Kofi Annan had the opportunity to formalize these things and have the heads of state through what we call then the Millennium Development Goals adopted. They deal with a range of issues, not only peace and security. So that declaration, which the heads of state committed to in 2000, and they have to recommit themselves all the time to this, until now having adopted 17 instead of 8. It's a continuation of the same duty or obligations of member states to continue to make the world a better place to live in.
Lwando, we heard the international body, the Amnesty International, saying leaders have to be held to accountable if they don't deliver on these promises. Are we going to have these? For instance, I noticed in one of the other documents I read around this issue, the Millennium Development Goals have not been attained fully, but the United Nations still says we must finalize those must be attained. And now we come with other sustainable development goals.
I mean, I think countries can do what's within their means, and I think most treaties of the United Nations permit that. It understands that not all countries have the same resources, and not everyone can comply to the same standard, but based on what you have, can you comply to the best of your ability? And that's where you get into issues of corruption, and that's why you have observers from the United Nations just making sure that that's not preventing a country from developing issues like that. So when it comes to accountability, I look at it holistically, even with the United Nations Security Council, in that there's a problem right now that I'm sensing in terms of the credibility of the United Nations. It releases, the Security Council, for instance, will release a resolution on something, and I find that there's a lot of backlash and people are skeptical because individual members of the United Nations Security Council, the permanent ones to be more precise, are not being held accountable for their own actions of breaching the rule of law and their own international obligations. So I feel that weakens the international law system, in that when other countries don't comply, the question is, what are you going to do? Because there's something I can always throw in your face that you're not doing, or you've just breached, the international law. So I find that there needs to be a strengthening at the core of international law for these goals to be realized.
Let me just staying with the Security Council, Mr. Nene. Security Council is actually where everything takes place. It's actually the sanctity of the United Nations, and we've seen on many occasions, because of the veto power each member who sits on the Security Council has, the permanent members, so to speak, they can veto any decision, so this thing doesn't go forward.
No. I'll also differ with you. The main body of the United Nations is the
General Assembly. I know.
The General Assembly has more authority and moral authority over any other substructure of the UN. But the Security Council was created such that it can intervene in terms of threat to international peace. So it's the only body in the whole system that have the power to act and that have to take decisions that will be binding on all member states. That's the only body. But all the others, it's a question of persuasion to make sure that the majority of member states carry on with. But I should also add that when Rio met to adopt a process that ended up in the social SDGs, it was a continuation from the MDGs. Of course, there was unbalanced attainment of MDGs, but it does not mean we're going to continue with MDGs, because those that remained and the new situation that confronts the world were incorporated by member states in order to come with it was 15 years, so 15 years over, now they've come up with the SDGs, and then they say Agenda 2030.
Well, we'll continue our discussion after this. If you'd like to join us, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights Recourse, or email us at rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Welcome to Network, a technology news program that also discusses what's trending in social media in and around Africa. MTN has launched its new movie and television streaming service, Front Row. If it's trending, we will find it. That's Network with me, Spumela Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. only on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we're talking about the United Nations 70th anniversary. I want to stay with the issue of the Security Council. There are many resolutions taken by the Security Council which are just ignored by certain members of the General Assembly, like Israel ignoring the resolutions around Palestine, and even in our old South Africa. South Africa used to ignore some of the resolutions that were taken by the Security Council.
No, I think there's been the resolution you are talking about. The resolutions you are talking about are resolutions of the General Assembly. The resolutions of the Security Council are very difficult to ignore. Israel has not ignored any resolution of the Security Council because the United States vetoes that resolution. So it's a question that it falls out of the table of the Security Council because it's taken over by the General Assembly.
Perhaps what you're referring to in terms of a resolution being ignored is that the Security Council referred the al-Bashir matter to the ICC. So by implication, by not adhering to the ICC's warrant of arrest, you may say that somewhere in there that the Security Council resolution has been ignored, but that's quite a stretch. I'm just saying that an argument can be made. But I think the problem with as Mr. Nena pointed out, is in terms of the veto power. And it's not just the explicit veto power. There's certain things that don't even make it onto the agenda of the United Nations Security Council because of a pocket veto that one of the P5 members has. And you have other members that are not permanent members who lobby permanent members that controversial matters should not make it onto the agenda, and that deprives the world, I think, of important debates when it comes to certain matters not even making it onto the agenda. And an example of a pocket veto that was used, I would say France used the threat of a veto when the United States wanted to invade Iraq. So that may not go with the rules of the Security Council, but a lot of people may say that France's threat of a veto was morally justified in terms of the rule of law, that the US wanted to invade Iraq on a very shaky legal foundation. And France, that's an example, I think, where a veto has been used, or a threat of a veto has been used.
I think in the case of Mr. Nene, if you help me if I'm wrong again, in the case of the Palestine, the issues, does the strong Jewish lobby in America play a role for America to veto any resolutions against Israel?
Well, I think the strong Jewish lobby, not only in America, in the US, all over the world where the Jews are found and have a strong base, like here in South Africa. They keep on complaining, but we continue, because of our values and principles, continue to support the Palestinians. But because I'm a diplomat, or a former diplomat, I won't talk about pocket
diplomat
veto.
Remains a diplomat.
I won't talk about pocket veto. But Kofi Annan once said, I quote him, that the issue of might is right relates to a situation, now I finish, might is right is what Kofi Annan said. The world has never been equal. It won't be equal. For a long time, I think it's utopia for us to think we'll all be equal in all facets of life. We won't. So those who are mightier than the others tend to want to use this resource that they have and impose it on those who they think must follow their principles or policies. And that's what happens at the United Nations Security Council. Sometimes, or more often than not, even the five don't agree. I know that because when we're in the Security Council, we managed, let's say, take a resolution on Iran. And the resolution on Iran, South Africa introduced for the first time the resolution of the five. The five go and caucus, and they want to impose it on the other non-permanent members. But we inserted 8 amendments, and they say it was the first time for a country that is not a permanent member to change the resolution that has to be adopted by Security Council. So it can be done, but it takes long.
The other issue I want to come to is, for instance, many people believe that the issues surrounding Syria could have been solved a long time ago. It's because of this fight between the members of the permanent members of the Security Council. Russia wants to support the president of Syria. America wants to remove, for a long time, America wanted to remove the president of Syria. And now we're sitting with this crisis of refugees in Europe.
I think there's also a step missing, because I think the thing with Syria is that when the United States wanted to introduce a resolution, I think, on military action, the question that has to be asked is whether have we reached a point of last resort, because that action would have to meet certain standards. And I think at the time it was regarding chemical weapons, if I'm not mistaken. But
yes, there was a case of chemical weapons having been used by the Syrian regime.
I think that's when the matter reached a climax, and it didn't go any further because there's nothing that warrants military action based on that justification alone. There's certain steps before that have to be taken. Could you call for a ceasefire? Has that happened? Economic sanctions, so many other things that you need to explore first before saying, can they do what they did in Libya and other places. So it's a bit inconsistent.
Now you're talking about Libya. Mr. Nene, why was it easier for the West to bombard Libya, and how did that resolution get passed so quickly?
No, let's start by saying in any multilateral setup, the issues that your representatives are dealing with, they are cross-cutting. So because they are cross-cutting, they are interrelated. And it would be amiss for a strategic analyst, because the issue of Syria, as you see it today, arises out of geostrategic policies. There are those who want to control the world, and there are those who don't want to control the world. So if you isolate Syria, you will end up forgetting there was Afghanistan. You will end up forgetting there was
Iraq.
You will end up forgetting there was Libya, if you isolate it. But if you take it, because to me these things, they relate to one another. As I said, they're cross-cutting, but they relate to what other people call the aims of regime change. And we know who is pursuing regime change. Even in Crimea, it was regime change.
You wanted to say something around that?
I think with Libya, what happened was that the League of Arab States came forward and proposed a resolution, and the resolution was to create a no-fly zone. There was never permission for military action, and Gaddafi was brought down by a mob. But since then, there hasn't been any condemnation, because his death, I mean, we can debate it, went against humanitarian law, and there hasn't been anything done to hold anyone accountable for that. And I think what made it legitimate was that the League of Arab States was involved and an African bloc, but what happened was that NATO then came to the forefront, and NATO is not mentioned anywhere in that resolution. So that's another problem for the Security Council. NATO can come in and out as it pleases, and there isn't any consistency or a strong legal base for NATO's actions in various conflicts in the world, including Yugoslavia.
I probably must be corrected, but we can come back to this after the break and close this issue of the Security Council so that we can go on to the Sustainable Development Goals. If you'd like to join us, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Recourse. Stay with us.
Good. Boy. Sit. Get behind Rugby World Cup 2015 on SABC.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourses to discuss the 70th anniversary of the United Nations failures and the successes of this august body. But let's first take this call from Durban. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon to the panel as well and the viewers. I'm Mrs. Jayashree Kiali, and I have a question to ask. However, I know we in South Africa need to achieve a lot with the government and international level to alleviate poverty. How can we achieve our goals to alleviate poverty when certain individuals from government officials block access to our communication with our ministers? However, I, Mrs. Kiali, have a major project from India, and I've been trying to reach our government. The ministers and the secretaries are totally blocking me. And how can our government achieve in 2030 when these blockages occur?
Thank you, Kiali. Let's first answer that question. I think what Kiali is referring to, more often than not, or all the times, these goals, including the Millennium Development Goals and these Sustainable Development Goals, have to be pursued by the various governments. And one of the problems is exactly the kind of problem Kiali came up with.
And that's access to political leadership.
Exactly.
I think the goals shouldn't be separated from our own constitutional goals. They're one and the same as far as I'm concerned, but now there's accountability to a supra body, if you will. And I think communication with ministers, perhaps we should start at a lower level.
What she actually means is who you know. It's who you know. If I don't know Mr. Nene, I'm not going to get help.
No, let's start by saying, if you are in the United Nations or the AU, you are representing your government. Your government has been elected by the electorate, like the caller now.
Kiali.
Amnesty International has just reminded the ordinary citizens that even if you elect people, they have to be accountable to you. So if they have to be accountable, you must hold them accountable all the time, so that those who block you, they will find no space. Because then accountability and transparency will be the order of the day, as South Africa has said so. That's the policies of the ruling party. So I think you don't find a serious difference between the adopted National Development Plan and the social development goals now.
We're about to go to the tweets, but before we go there, Mr. Nene, you wanted to explain something around the fact that when the resolution was taken against Libya, South Africa voted for the resolution, and you wanted to explain that.
Well, the AU got involved and prescribed how to deal with the Libyan issue. President Zuma went 3 times when we knew it was very dangerous area, but he sneaked into it, spoke to Libya to say we can find a solution. But the AU had given a mandate to its representative in Geneva, where there's an AU office, and in New York, because there's an AU office in all UN centers. So, because we say we conduct our foreign policy openly, transparently, and we have certain values. So we stick to that. So we were carrying the AU torch to say we will stick to this. And what we do in the UN, we normally will then canvass for this opinion to be adopted by other groups, whether it's Arab League, whether it's all of them. But when the resolution was drawn up, as you say, the situation was becoming difficult, exacerbated by the press. At the critical hour, you know, when I say critical hour, sometimes it can be 4 o'clock in the morning. Susan Rice, who was a U.S. representative, introduced that phrase with what do you call it? Any other means. Now, any other means can be interpreted sometimes out of context of the body of the resolution, and I think that's what happened. But because we stuck to the AU instruction, we had to vote for. I know we sent people to go and say, are the Russians going to vote this way? We contacted them. And then the trick we use, we say, I still have to contact headquarters. So by the time New York is asleep, is working, South Africa is asleep.
So
couldn't get to know how Russia is going to vote, how China is going to vote, but we have consulted all of them. And then it was difficult to go back to Addis Ababa and say, here is the situation, we need to adjust. There was no time.
Well,
but then it was a question of dumping your principles.
I know you guys want to talk about this, you wanted to come into this issue, but let's first hear what the Twitter community has to say about this issue. We also have a caller on the line, but we'll go to that caller. Andiles Gastatu says UN has failed to protect other countries when attacked by USA. I think it's because it was funded by the Rockefellers. We'll come to that. Why is it so difficult to hold member states accountable? Example is the war waged by America in Iraq. Andiles Gastatu comes back again. I have not seen any successes in the UN except that they allow America to attack African states. They appear as soldiers of America. Zarka Cannabis, that's a strange name, says MDG failed to eradicate poverty. What's different with SDG? Accountability, less talk, and more implementation. But I want to go, there's a call on the line, I'm told, Nathan from the Free State. Nathan, good afternoon, and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Afternoon, Dumila, how are you?
Fine, thanks, how are you?
Yes, I've got comments which I want your panel to comment on as well.
Yes, Nathan?
The first one is that is the issue of funding of the United Nations. I want to know who funds the United Nations, because whoever puts more money, the United Nations has got more say. And then number two, the issue of South Africa in the when it has got that non-permanent seats, I've realized that whenever they are voting, they either follow Russia or China, and they do not have a backbone of their own. They do not represent African interests. So I want the ambassador to comment on that. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Nathan. Let's first start with Nathan's questions. Who is funding the United Nations? Mr. Nene, you've been there. You probably know. Somebody said on the Twitter the Rockefellers are funding.
No, it's not true. All member states. There's a scale that assesses member states. The UN has a team under what is called as a controller. That's like their AG. They will then assess the member states according to their GDP and say, you are going to contribute so much according to the assessed scale and all that. And sometimes even those that he thinks that they are big powers, more often than not, it's not the US that contributes more to the pace of the United Nations. More often than not, it's Japan. And that's a reality, that's a fact.
Let's hold our thought for a minute. Nathan has got another question, which is a very important question he asked. But let's first go to a break, because we need to go to a break. Please stay with us and also call us like Nathan and Kiali has done. Stay with us.
Catch! Point! Sit!
Get behind Rugby World Cup 2015 on SABC.
We live in a digital era, and the number of Africans with mobile phones is rapidly increasing.
Twitter use is predominantly being done on smartphones. This is a very African phenomenon.
Here, there are constantly new innovative ways to make the internet more affordable. With that, we're seeing protests against governments proposing methods to limit access. On Network, we give you information about all of this. We also have new computers, games, and robots.
Join Siphumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 19:30 CAT.
SABC brings to you Rugby World Cup 2015. Let's do this.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we continue to discuss the 70th anniversary of the United Nations and its failures and successes. Mr. Nene, you were still explaining the funding model. I know Luando wanted to add something. I wanted to finalize the funding model theme.
No, I finalized the funding model to say there's an assessment.
The second question okay, let's go to the second question from Nathan. Nathan is saying, when South Africa was on the Security Council as a non-permanent member, they either voted with China or with Russia. They did not they did not represent Africa properly.
No, it's not true. China and Russia on the issue of Libya, they abstained.
What Nathan was meaning, South Africa was voting with China and Russia on all issues.
No, it's
and
not
remember,
true.
there was the issue of Myanmar, where South Africa voted with China and Russia.
No, South Africa voted with the majority of the member states in the General Assembly, and were guided by our constitution. You can't, you see, like Maimia, the Secretary General had sent his envoy, former foreign minister of Nigeria. You can't, as United Nations, send your own representative, even before he comes and reports, and you take another action. It doesn't make sense.
You wanted to add something to what the issue we had with that call from Kiali.
She asked, how do you realize the goals if you cannot hold your leaders accountable, and if you feel that you don't have a voice in terms of service delivery? I just wanted to remind the caller that there are legal mechanisms where you can hold the government to accountable to meet these goals. You can engage an NGO. You can use the legal system, as we've seen, that they can interpret these international commitments that we have, and certainly interpret for us to what extent are they legally binding. Those that we are not too sure, those that are not legally binding resolutions do have some legal impact. And I just wanted the caller to know that there are mechanisms of getting involved in assuring that these goals are somehow met.
Mr. Nene, one of the other things about the United Nations over the years is the international jurisprudence that they brought into being in the form of the ICC. And we've seen recently that Africa is beginning to have second thoughts around the functioning and the way the ICC functions.
No, it's true that it was the ICC was formed by initiative of member states. And because those who are in the legal fraternity and those who are politicians will tell you it was a noble idea to have established the ICC, and South Africa was at the forefront. And I think South Africa still thinks it's a noble idea. But as things went along with the ICC, with Akompo, the first prosecutor,
Ocampo, yes.
He was very unpopular in the General Assembly. That is now with the third world countries, very unpopular. Then he leaves a very tarnished prosecution of the ICC to the present prosecutor who comes from the Gambia. And why all this? The problem is we have to weigh which comes first, justice or peace. Can you get peace out of justice? We don't think so. We think if there's an eminent realization of having a peace settlement, you will then thereafter institute your legal action against certain individuals. But the ICC,
as it happened with the
its statutes allows them to say they're not going to wait for this. So the biggest problem between most of the AU and the ICC was that because there's a clause in the ICC in the Rome Statutes to defer action and give a process so that this process can at least benefit the majority of the people, that is peace process. Now the African Union in their thinking was that a sitting head of state, if a sitting head of state gets arrested or is charged, it may interfere with a process towards establishing peace. So the African Union is convinced about this, the issue that deferment is there in the ICC. Let's deal with the issue of conflict. And obviously, the conflict, the ordinary people suffer most, and the women and children are the worst sufferers. But to take that somebody to the ICC does not mean the conflict is going to end.
I want you to address this issue of the deferment. As Mr. Nene says, it's in the Rome Statute.
I just wanted to go back to something else also of inconsistency that's highlighted in the ICC. And it's an extension of an inconsistency in the Security Council. If you look at the al-Bashir matter, for instance, there was a point in time where it was America was concerned with the human rights violations in Sudan and referred the al-Bashir matter to the Security Council. It was voted on. But what happened was during this whole saga with al-Bashir here, I don't think you heard much from the US in terms of condemning South Africa and its actions in strong terms. And I think that's because now the US has an interest in Sudan. It goes back into self-serving and national interest, and that's to fight terrorism and sort of having some sort of relationship with Sudan because it helps them in terms of geopolitical issues. And that's also right now, the inconsistencies highlighted by the Habre trial that's happening in Senegal. That was sanctioned by the ICJ, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations, that said, Senegal, you must convene a court and try Habre. But Habre didn't commit those crimes alone. So it goes back to moral glass houses. We all occupy moral glass houses where we don't want to say we are wrong because we know that so many other people have done the same thing. So why should I be the one to be tried when I know that there are leaders out there who've done the exact same thing? He's facing trial alone without the US and France that helped him in the 80s to do what he did. So I think that is the weakest point of the international criminal justice system, and that's inconsistency. Not everyone is equal before the law.
You want to say something, Mr. Nene, on this point?
You see, my understanding, the ICJ offers legal opinion to the United Nations. It's part of international justice system. So it's an opinion. It remains an opinion. And those who don't want it, as member states, will not implement it. But then let me finish with the ICC. The ICC loses its credibility in Africa because all of us say justice delayed is justice denied. The President Gbagbo has been kept in the ICC. Has been kept there for more than 2 years. Whenever the prosecutors try to bring up a charge, the judges say they throw it out because it's weak, but they are not releasing him. If it was here, we would be making noise, all of us. You can't have somebody incarcerated, waiting trial for so many years. Now he's a former head of state, sitting there. No one is saying anything. Not America, not the biggest lawyers in this world are saying anything.
Isn't that the dichotomy, though? We have these Millennium Development Goals and we have these Sustainable Development Goals. And earlier we spoke about holding leadership to accountable. And if people in a country cannot hold a leader to account for what the leader has not done or the leader has misused, abused power, how do you then hold this leader to account if he cannot be taken to The Hague?
Don't vote for him. Don't vote for him. Let him out. Let him get out through a political process.
I think you have to remember that the international law system is a secondary system. It starts internally and how strong our system is.
Well, it's a pity we cannot speak about all of these things that the United States has done and what the United States has done successfully and has failed on. Time is not on our side. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us about this. Mr. Nene, I know you are a replacement for somebody else who's not well. Thank you very much for your time. Ms. Lwando Paso, thank you very much for your time either. And this has been Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated at 10 tonight and at 5 on Monday morning. From all of us here in the studio and the rest of the team, thank you to our guests and good afternoon.